I want to share some words with you. And I want to ask you at the end who you think wrote the words. Okay? Easy enough, right? This nation is filled with immorality, and godless individuals. Its people are parched of any morality and justice. Parents can't raise children, and children ignore their parents. What this country deserves is for its cities to be destroyed and its people shipped out. God has turned away from this country because of its arrogance. I call on the nations of the world to invade this country, to cross its borders, to kill the corrupt in our midst. Our farmland should become decimated. Our rivers should dry up. And only then will this boastful and arrogant nation recognize the wrongs that it has committed in its name. Thoughts? Had to get myself worked up to get it going. You fell right into my trap. Thank you very much. She said, it must be the words of Reverend Wright. Well, it just so happens, they're not. Just so happens that these words come from no place other than our Bible. And it just so happens, with a couple of modifications, I left out I looked around and saw there were some kids in the congregation. I decided there were some things I shouldn't say, and I modernized them a bit. Your kid I wasn't worried about. She won't remember them. But these are the words of Hosea, the biblical prophet. And I knew someone would guess Reverend Wright, because that kind of language, that angry, that indignant, that outrageous, that belligerent text that I just read comes right out of the Bible. And it's not only Hosea. There are 14 other prophets. You could open to any of their pages, and they would sound the exact same way. Sure, they'd be talking to Israel and the Israelites in Judah and Jerusalem, and they'd be cursing our people, and they'd be worse. Because it's the language of outrage. That's what it is. It's the language that's filled with hyperbole. It's language that's full of drama. It's harsh. It's full of condemnation. And what it represents, certainly in the language of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, is condemnation of the people for their decadence and for their, what was perceived by the prophets then, immorality. And these were the prophets who stood up against kings, who stood up against priests in the temple, who stood up against the rich and the powerful in their communities, and had the audacity to look them in the eyes and say to them, don't think that because of your power and your status that you're immune from this, because this applies to you too. These were harsh words. And if I were to use that language today in this congregation, you'd be astounded. If I spoke to you like the prophets spoke to our ancestors thousands of years ago, you'd walk out on me. And we've learned to soften our voices. We've learned to be more polite and reverent. We've learned to recognize that after all this is being taped. Who knows who's in our midst? I don't want to misspeak, because if I misspeak, it might come back to haunt me. It has sometimes, trust me. But there are religious institutions in this country where that kind of language is spoken every Sunday. There are religious institutions in this country where the preachers stand up in front of their congregations and speak language that for us is offensive, sounds belligerent, it's disturbing. And we become, in hearing that language, shocked and outraged ourselves. And that's where you were right. Because that language is more often than not used in African American churches. And that's the context that we have to recognize for understanding Jeremiah Wright, the biblical prophets, not our polite congregations. Not the congregations where we watch our words and we write out the difficult text to make sure we say it right. We have to understand what passes for preaching in an African American congregation, and the truth is we don't understand unless we've been there. Now I want to make sure of one thing before I go on. I am not endorsing a candidate, and I want to be really clear about that. Nor am I defending Jeremiah Wright. And anyone who reads either of those things into my words has misunderstood me. That is not my intent. My intent is to speak about how little we know about a subculture right in our midst. People who we work with, people who we spend our days with, people who may be even members of our family, but we don't understand it. We don't understand the culture. We don't understand that language. We don't understand where the language comes from. We don't understand why they use the words. We don't understand why they speak that way. We don't get it. And so when we hear the language recorded and passed around on YouTube or written down on the internet, we're outraged. But that outrage we have to recognize. And I'm not saying that every word is correct, but we have to recognize that that outrage comes from a basic lack of understanding for what it is to be black in this country, for what it is to have parents who were slaves, or grandparents who were slaves, for what it is to wake up every morning knowing that as soon as you step out of your door, people look at you differently. We don't get that. We don't know what it takes to express those feelings that you might have when oppression is in your recent memory. We don't know that. We don't get rap music. Our kids might listen to it, and we might condemn it, maybe even we listen to it. But we don't understand where it comes from. We don't understand the institution of the black church. We might say we do. We might say English is English, but we don't understand. We don't know what it is to have segments of our community in prison. We don't know what it is to have large segments of our community in poverty. We don't know what it is to have our mothers raising children alone. We don't know that. And I want to tell you, I thought of this topic over the past week. And I wrote the words out yesterday. And I was surprised to learn this morning, read in the LA Times, that there was an editorial by someone named Michael Eric Dyson, a sociology professor at Georgetown University, who spoke about Martin Luther King Jr., because this is the 40th anniversary of his murder, and spoke about him in the same context. He said that Martin Luther King moderated his words for the white audience, but when he stood in front of a black church, he was equally prophetic and used that prophetic voice. But you see, back then, there was no YouTube, there was no internet, there was no black presidential candidate. So no one was really interested in the words he spoke to the black churches, only in the words he spoke to the white audience. Right is no Martin Luther King. I want to say it again, I'm not excusing his language, but I'm pointing out how little we understand each other. And what I want to suggest to you is that you can substitute any other description of a subculture in America into that phrase about how we don't understand each other. We don't understand the Mexican immigrant culture. We don't get Persian culture if we're not Persian. We don't get Catholic culture if we haven't stepped foot inside a Catholic church. We don't get Methodist and Presbyterian culture. We don't get Asian American culture. We don't know. Unless we've been so close to an Asian American family or a black family or a Presbyterian family as to spend time in their household and have conversations about these issues with them. Just to work next to somebody is not to understand. But that language of outrage, getting back to that language of outrage, I want to reclaim it. Because we invented it. We did. Our prophets were the ones who spoke that way. Our prophets who were outraged at the ills of society to such an extent that they had the audacity to speak in such hyperbole. Because what that prophetic outrage sought to do was to achieve meaningful change. It's an outrage that one expresses when you feel such a sense of umbrage at what society perpetrates on itself that you have to say something. It's language that evokes passion and anger and harsh words. Because our prophets were outraged. They didn't turn to their friends and grouse in private. They didn't bang off an angry email to each other. Instead, they stood on the street corners on a platform and they screamed it at the top of their lungs. They didn't have a handy-dandy microphone like I have. They screamed it at the top of their lungs and they shouted in the face of priests. And they stood up to kings. And they told kings parables like they told King David about his audacity to sleep with Bathsheba when she was a married woman. And they brought them down in their words. We need more outrage in this community. We need people to be outraged at what's going on in this world. So that's what I want to ask you. What are you outraged about? Are you outraged about